students, I welcome you all to my today's session, which is titled as Class and Intersectionality. So as you can make out from the title of the module, we will be discussing about class, the notion of class, and we will also learn about a particular approach to dealing with class, which is intersectionality. Class is one of the most basic and earliest concepts which has been dealt with in sociological literature. At the same time, it is one of the most complex and most difficult concepts that we have in sociological literature. As one of the basic and universal form of stratification, sociological analysis and theories of class have evolved in many directions over the years. And in this module, we will seek to present the varied understandings of class, and also we will discuss one of the most important approaches which has been used for class analysis, that is intersectionality approach. So the structure of the module is like this. We will first discuss what is class, and then we will go over to the theories of class, and finally we will discuss class and intersectionality, which would include the following sub-themes. So first we will discuss what is meant by intersectionality approach, then how do we use intersectionality approach, and finally how do we apply the intersectionality approach for the analysis of class. So what is class? Encyclopedia Britannica defines social class as a group of people within a society who possesses the same socioeconomic status. Class, in the modern sense of the term, had its origins in the industrial societies, which are seen as predominantly class societies as opposed to the status societies of pre-industrial era. For example, the feudal society. The feudal society were seen as mainly status society as opposed to class society. As Crompton notes, in the modern world, class-based organizations, that is organizations claiming to represent classes and class interests, have been the dynamic source of the many changes and transformations which have characterized the modern era. We will now go over to discussing some of the theories of class. First, we will discuss two classical theorists, and then we will move over to some of the contemporary theorists of class. To begin with, I start off with the work of Karl Marx. Marx defines class in terms of the ownership of the means of production. In other words, according to him, at every stage of society, there are two fundamental classes that emerge. Those who own the means of production, that is, the different factors which would lead to the production process, such as tools, machinery, factory, labor, etc., and those who do not own the means of production. So for Marx, the key classes in the capitalist mode of production are the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the capitalists and the landless wage workers. These classes, according to Marx, are in conflict with each other, and they emerge as the class which is the exploiter and the class which is the exploited. He explains that in capitalist societies, the basis of the exploitation lies in surplus value. That is, the value which is generated by the workers over and above what is required for their own sustenance. And this surplus value is appropriated exclusively by the capitalist. Thus, through his definition of class, what Marx does is to emphasize on the structural location of class relations, because he thinks that it is the means of production, the ownership or the non-ownership of the means of production, which defines a particular class. However, we have to note that Marx also emphasizes upon a subjective dimension of class, and this he does through his analysis of class consciousness. He defines something which he calls the social class. And what is the social class? Social class is that class which is aware of its common location and common situation. Thus, in Marx's definition, we see both an objective and a subjective understanding of class. Coming to the next theorist, that is Max Weber, it is important to point out that Weber largely agrees with Marx that in capitalist society, economic relations do play a particular crucial role in the shaping of inequalities between individuals and groups. However, the definition of class that he provides is fundamentally different from that of Marx. He is defining the class in the following manner. A class comes to be formed when a number of people have in common a specific causal component of their life chances, insofar as this component is represented exclusively by economic interests in the possession of goods and opportunities for income, and is represented under the conditions of the commodity or labor market. This is the original definition of class that Weber provides us. Now, what is important to note here is that Weber is defining class in relation to market rather than the ownership of means of production. So, essentially for Weber, it is the inequalities in market capacity which determine the position people occupy in the social hierarchy. The capacities people have in terms of the skills that they bring to the labor market, and this explains the rewards that they will receive, which will ultimately determine their class location. So, where people have a good market capacity, such as accountants or engineers, they will have a good life chance. So, this definition is obviously a much wider definition of class than the basic division that Marx provides us between the owner and the non-owner of the means of production. And now I move over to one of the most prominent neo-Marxian theorists of class. Eric Olin Wright basically follows Marxian framework of understanding class, but he extends his basic framework to understand classes in advanced capitalism. And he says that one of the problems of using the traditional Marxian framework to understand class in these advanced capitalist societies is that it cannot explain the rise of the middle class. Where do we fit the middle class into this framework? So, as you know that exploitation is central to Marx's analysis of class, and he basically divides the classes into the exploiters and the exploited. But Wright is arguing that this analysis based on class polarization is perhaps not enough to explain class dynamics in advanced capitalism. So, what he does is he identifies the major problem with this framework, which is the problem of the middle class. So, here are a group of people who do not possess their own means of production, who do sell their labor, but at the same time they do not form part of the working class. So, where do we place them? Where do we incorporate them within the Marxian framework. So, in order to deal with this problem, Wright introduces two additional elements to Marxian theory. The first element, according to him, is authority and understanding the authority relations. The second is an analysis of skills and expertise. So, in terms of authority relations, Wright will argue that middle class occupy contradictory positions. Managers and supervisors, for example, occupy positions of authority in relation to the workers because they control and dominate them. At the same time, they are also controlled and dominated by the capitalists, and therefore, they occupy a position which is subordinate to the capitalists. The second element is the possession of skills and expertise, and Wright argues that middle class employees often have higher levels of skills and expertise, and therefore, they actually have more favorable position in relation to exploitation. So, firstly, in relation to this, he says that in case of the middle class, the knowledge and skills that they possess are scarce resources. It is limited by talent and the acquisition of certain credentials. As a result, people with these expertise and skills are often able to command higher wages. And second, their expertise and knowledge is extremely difficult to monitor and control. Thus, the employers try to force loyalty enhancing mechanisms for these occupations to secure their cooperation. And this often takes the form of loyalty rent. Thus, we see that Wright helps us to understand the complexity of the class structure in advanced capitalism, and he is suggesting a more nuanced way of analyzing class. Now, we move over to some of the contemporary theories of class, and one of the important figures of British sociology who has extensive contribution to the theory of class is John Goldthorpe. And Goldthorpe developed a thesis of affluent worker which became quite popular in the 1960s. So, in their famous work, Goldthorpe and others, this idea that workers have gone through a process of embourgeoisement in the West, this idea has to be more critically looked at. Based on their own empirical work in Britain, they argue that the working class, even if they had experienced some upward mobility, were not as wealthy as their middle class peers, and they retain important aspects of their proletarian identities. And they still have their distinctive social values, political ideals, and styles of life. So, basically they are arguing against the embourgeoisment thesis of the working class in the 1960s. And lastly, I will discuss the theory of Pierre Bourdieu, who is one of the most significant theorists of contemporary times, who has contributed to the understanding of class in a unique way. His understanding of class as capital widens the understanding of class in fundamental ways. This idea of class as capital basically tries to expand the idea that class is determined by economic capital. He argues that class is not just based on economic capital, but he identifies three other related forms of capital. First, cultural capital, second, social capital, and third, what he calls symbolic capital. So, basically his theory emphasizes on the need to go beyond an economistic understanding of class. So, what are these? forms of capital that he introduces. Firstly, economic capital is something that we mostly know about, which includes income, wealth, financial inheritance, and other monetary assets. Bourdieu introduces cultural capital as something which is unique to his theory. And for him, cultural capital comprises of knowledge, skills, and other social competences which give an edge to the individuals in terms of social hierarchy. He also talks about something called the social capital. What is the social capital? It is basically the resources which are based on social networks, connections, and group membership. So basically this is the capital which is generated through relationships and useful relationships. Finally, he talks about symbolic capital, which is basically the form the different types of capital take once they are perceived and recognized as legitimate. And now we move over to the second part of our discussion today, which is about the intersectionality approach. So as I told you, we will begin with what is meant by intersectionality, and then we will see how intersectionality approach is used for the analysis of class. So one of the most important frameworks that has emerged over the years to understand social stratification is the intersectionality approach. So this approach basically emphasizes that class has to be analyzed in terms of the intersections with other forms of structured inequalities such as gender, race, caste, sexuality, and so on. So what are the origins of this intersectionality approach? It has been popularized by the feminist theoretical tradition. The feminists have highlighted the relevance of this concept in understanding marginality and particularly racial marginality. The term intersectionality was first coined and used by feminist scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989. However, this approach has been in use much before this in Black feminist writings. These scholars have used the idea of intersections to critique both white Eurocentric middle class conceptualizations of feminism as well as the male dominated models of ethnic and racial studies. And some scholars have argued that this tradition of work emerged as early as the 19th century in the writings of figures such as Maria Stuart and W.E.B. Du Bois. So what is Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality? Crenshaw argues that the experience of women of color can only be understood by placing them at the intersections of gender and race. She specifically takes up the case of violence against colored women and how only an intersectional approach can address both gender and race together and thereby help us to understand the specific experiences of these colored women. And she writes, I quote from her, "I argue that black women are sometimes excluded from feminist theory as well as anti-racist policy discourse because they are predicated on a discrete set of experiences that often does not accurately reflect the intersection of race and gender. These problems of exclusion cannot be solved simply by including black women within an already established analytical structure because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum total of racism and sexism. Any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which black women are subordinated, unquote. So Collins points out some of the characteristics of intersectional analysis. What are these? And all of these are very, very important. First is, it places the lived experience of the people and the struggles of people of color and other marginalized identities as a starting point for the development of a theory. So it focuses on the struggles of the marginalized. And secondly, it explores the complexity not only of individual identities but also group identity. Third, it unveils the ways interconnected domains of power organize and structure inequality and oppression. And finally, it promotes social justice and social change by linking research and practice to create a holistic approach to deal with the problem of eradication of disparities. Now, how has the intersectionality approach used in social science? So, today intersectionality is an emerging field of study, and the method of analysis is to interrogate racial, ethnic, class, physical ability, age, sexuality and gender disparities, and to contest the existing ways of looking at these structures of inequality. So basically what it does is to do two things. First, it brings the question of identity at the center of understanding inequality. And second, it has special relevance for understanding marginality and those having marginal identities. In India too, feminists have used intersectionality approach to understand gender, and some of the prominent feminist thinkers who have used this approach include Sharmila Rege and Uma Chakravarti. Sharmila Rege, for example, is a proponent of Dalit feminism in India, wherein she talks about the intersections of caste and gender throughout her writings. Dalit feminism, I quote, problematizes the historically constituted opposition between the rights of women and those of the so-called backward castes and minorities. So how do we use the intersectionality approach for the analysis of class? So one of the prominent contemporary thinkers who has worked on intersectionality approach in her class analysis is Beverly Skeggs. Skeggs talks about the importance of class in understanding women's subjectivity. She argues that class analysis is usually neglected in most feminist theories today, and therefore she emphasizes on the need to reinstate class in feminist cultural analysis. For example, she points out how respectability is an idea that is fundamental to understand one's positionality, and particularly class positionality. And I quote from Skeggs, "Without understanding the significance of class positioning, many of the women's movements through social space, through education, families, labor markets, and in particular in the production of their subjectivity could not be understood." Throughout her works, Skeggs foregrounds the importance of recognizing class as a social location which is rooted in material inequalities. And I wind up with today's discussion. As I mentioned, this module had two basic parts to it, which deals with, the first part deals with analysis of class, and the second part deals with the intersectionality approach to class. So what we had done, what we had sought to do, is to understand the concept of class and give an overview of some of the major theories of class from classical to the contemporary era, And this part of the discussion tried to show the complexity of the concept of class and how sociological analysis of class has moved beyond an economic understanding of class. And we also tried to understand how the intersectionality framework is applied for class analysis. This part of the discussion began with what is meant by intersectionality, and then it moved over to understand the importance of this framework to understand social stratification. And the last part of the discussion focused on how this approach has been used in class analysis. With that, I end my today's module, and I hope to see you all in my next session. Thank you.